So in today's tutorial, we're going to cover how we create a chain link fence such as the one I have here. As well, make sure you guys stay to the end because I think you're going to like what I have in store. And so I've jumped into Substance Designer, and the first thing I'm going to do is go up to File and New Substance. We want to make sure we've got Physically Base selected. We want to make sure that our size mode is relative to parent, and I'm going to leave the width and the height on 1024 by 1024, and we're going to call this first graph chain. And I'll hit enter. I'm going to bring this guy down a little bit, and we're good to go. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we save our package. So I'm going to just save this guy out. And we are good to go. So like always, I want to make a base material so that we can see all of our work being done in our 3D view here. And I'm going to change it to dielectric. And I'm going to expose our normal and our height. And if I right click this guy here and I view in the 3D, we'll get that showing up. So I'm going to bring in a normal map, and I'm going to make sure that I toggle our nodes or our sockets here, our connections, to be angular. I also want to make sure, just for compatibility for Unity 5 or Unity 2017, that we've got our alpha channel with input. So the first thing when going about creating this material is trying to think about what kind of shape that we are going to try and mimic. And the best way to go about it that I found is actually using a waveform node. And off the bat, it really doesn't resemble anything like a chain link, but if we play around with our parameters for a little bit, you might start to see it coming to fruition. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we only have one of these waveforms showing up. So I'm going to come down here to our wave number, and I'm just going to bring that down to 1. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that we don't have all of this I guess these lines or these like slivers through our shape here. So I want to make sure that we increase our samples up to 1024. And so now we're going to get in the middle here just a solid color. If we zoom in, I'll just bring this guy out a little bit. And so now I want to come down here to our noise parameter. And right now we've got kind of the ends falling off to these really basically stretched noise. And if I bring this down, we start to decrease it to the point where we have no noise. And now it's just a very subtle gradient or a fall off of our initial shape here. And so I'm going to come down to our pattern, and this is just scrubbing through, going to give us a bunch of different patterns that we can use for our material here, or for our shape. So the pattern that I used is just pattern 1, because it gives us this nice sharp line or sharp edge that we can start to use for our shape. And so now we've kind of got the base form for what our chain link is going to start looking like. So I'm going to bring this guy back, and I'm going to just plug him into our normal and our height. And so you're going to see it kind of subtly shows up. If I just increase the intensity on our normal map to something like 3, it's going to show up a little bit nicer. And I want to make sure that I go into Materials, Default, and Edit. And I just want to bump our scale up to 1. And that's going to just display in our 3D view here our parallax occlusion, or kind of our fake height geometry. So we want to start off by, first of all, rotating our shape here, because we want these two ends to be the the top and the bottom of our chain link, and then we're going to have these rounded sides be how the chains kind of interlock with each other or kind of wrap around each other. And that'll make a lot of sense once we get further down. So the way I'm going to go about doing that is I'm going to create a transform 2D. And I'm going to plug this guy in. And so now we're going to get our manipulation tools or our handles around our texture here. And so I'm going to come down into our parameters, and I want to go down to where it says rotation. And I'm just going to click 90 degrees clockwise. Again, inversely you can do it 90 degrees counterclockwise and it will give you the same result. And so now we've got our sharper ends down at the bottom and the top, and we've got our rounded edges along the sides. And I'm going to just copy and paste the same node, still being connected from our waveform here, because what I want to do is take our top guy here, and I want to subtract any white values in this from all the white values in the one below. And what I'm going to do first is I want to move this guy off to the left just a little bit so that we get only a slight overlap where we still have some of our bottom material or our bottom texture here. So first I'm going to blend these two together. And I'm going to click on our blend, and I want to make sure that our blending mode is set to subtract. So right now it's taking the top texture, subtracting any white value from the bottom texture where there's also any white value. So because they're stacked identically over top of each other, we're going to get a completely black texture. But if I take our top and I start to move it off to the side or down a little bit, you can see the effect that it's taking. Now if I move it down too far, you can also see another issue we're going to run into, where we've got our texture tiling. So on our top texture here, I just want to make sure that we go to our tiling mode, we click on this and hit absolute, and now we can just check off tiling because we don't want the texture to tile. We just want to have one texture that we can affect the bottom texture with. So if I double click on this to see what the blend is doing, and I single click back on our top transform, I'm going to come back up and I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm going to take our Y value and I'm going to bump it down to negative 0.03. And now we've got one side of our chain link here. And this is the effect that I'm going to repeat, but I want to get the left side. So I'm going to take these three nodes here, I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to paste them, and I'm going to put them just underneath. And so double clicking on this blend and single clicking over here, we want to get the same distance that we got for this side of the chain to make it symmetrical. So what I'm going to do is just take our Y here, and I'm going to go 0.03 in the positive. And so now we've got both our right and our left side of our chain link. And so now I've got both my right side and my left side, and I want to blend those two together. So I'm going to just hit blend, and I'm going to take our right and put it up top, and I'm going to take our left and put it in the bottom. And so what I want to do is I want to create our screen blending mode so that we're going to get rid of any of the black values of our top texture here and just put the white textures over top of the bottom texture here. And so we get this kind of looping effect. So if I bring these guys back and I plug them in, now you can slightly start to see the chain link geometry that we've created and that we're going to tile later down in our material. And so now from here, I want to make sure that our normal map starts to appropriately display our geometry as well as our height map. And so in order to do that, I've got to make sure that our geometry isn't so contrasting with the white and the black values. So on top of our blend, I'm just going to add a blur, and I'm actually going to delete that. I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale, just so that we have a little bit more control over our blending. So if I click on that, I want to bring the intensity down to something like 2 or 3, because with a chain, it's actually a cylinder that's been warped and bent, so we don't get the very rigid cubed off edges on our chain link. As well, we can turn the quality up to 1 just so that we get some very concise blurring. And I'm liking that for right now. As is just a little bit of housekeeping as well, I want to make sure that going into our height input or output, I want to add a levels node, just so that we have more control over how our material is actually displaying on our 3D mesh here. And so what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to take our black output and I'm just going to ramp that up so that the white and the black are relatively close to each other, just so that we don't have the deep recesses like we would because of our very dark color data within our, or our grayscale data within our texture map here. So I'm going to bump that back up just so we get a little bit. And so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take our blurred off geometry here and I'm going to tile it. So I'm going to add a tile generator, and I want to make sure that our output is plugged into our pattern input on the top socket there, and we can delete the background. And if I click on my tile generator, we have to go down to our pattern, and we want to make sure that our pattern is on our image input. So what we basically just plugged into our generator here. And you can start to see that it's already giving us that fence look or that chain link kind of formation. And so we're already off to a good start. But we've got a little bit of an issue because none of our geometry is intersecting or touching each other, and none of the actual geometry is bending and warping and linking with each other like it would in a chain link fence. So the first thing that I want to do with our tile generator is I just want to bump up our pattern size just a little bit, just so that we get our materials intersecting with one another. And so I bump it up to 1.14 because when we get the effect working, we're going to want to have a little bit of space or distance in between our chains here. So I'm going to go back to our tile and I'm going to just decrease the Y amount to 4. Actually, we'll bring it down to 3. And I'm going to decrease the X amount down to 4. The next thing that I notice about our material is that we get these little moments or these little spots where the geometry intersects on our texture and it peaks. We get a very, very sharp white value. And so the way that we go about fixing that is if we come down in our tile generator to our color tab, and we come down to our blending mode, we want to make sure that we set that to max. And now it's going to look like they just intersect with each other and they cut off. And so that's starting to look pretty good, but we've also got some other blatant issues now that we've got our material or our textures tiling. One issue I've noticed is that on the corners or on the edges of the intersection of our chain, we've got this sharp cutoff. And if we come back to our blending between the two and we come to our blur, you can see that our texture actually cuts off right at the edge of our blur. And so in order to fix that, we just want to make sure that we downscale our texture either before or after our blend. In this case, I'm going to do it before. So I want to make sure after our blend that we add a transformation 2D node. And I'm going to come into our width and our height here. And I'm just going to set them down to about 85% each. Making sure to hit enter. And we also want to make sure, like our transformations up here, that we've got our tiling set to absolute and no tiling, so that we don't get any geometry in our texture space here. And now, because we've downscaled our texture, we get the problem where none of our chains are intersecting with each other again. So we want to just come back to our tile generator, and we want to make sure that we just bump up our scale once again, enough so that we get a little bit of a gap in between, and something like 1.28 should be fine for now. And so the next issue that we face is when we take a look at how our chains interact or intersect with each other vertically, they just kind of come down to a point. And that's not how chains actually interact with each other. They come up and they swirl around a little bit, and then they continue being looped around. And so how we're going to go about doing that is back here where we created our right and our left sides, we need to add a transformation 2D node on each side, and we just move them in to each other. So on our right side, I'm going to add a transformation 2D, and the same thing for our left side. So I'm going to double click on our blend here, and I'm going to single click on our right node. So I'm going to come down, and I want to just bring in our right side towards our left so that they're kind of intersecting with each other at the points. And this, so if I come down and I switch our X value and increase that up to something like, we'll say 4, you can see that when these start to loop with each other vertically, now we're getting a little bit of our wire showing each individual, and we're going to make those swirl around or kind of fake a bit of a swirl so that it looks like they're looping and twisting around. And so we want to do the same thing with our left side. So we've got the offset set to 0.04, and if we come down here, we want to make sure that our X is set to negative 0.04. And if we take a look in our blend, now we've got a completely symmetrical looking mesh or geometry here. And if we take a look in our 3D view, at a distance it kind of looks like it comes around and then wraps around again. And so we're going to just tighten that up as we continue down our chain here. And as you can see, as we were testing our material and kind of creating it, we've once again moved and downscaled the size of our chain links here. So there's two ways that we can go about regaining the size and getting it back. One way is just to go back to our tile generator, and we can bump up the size so that we start to get some overlap again, but that causes the issue of our vertical, our top and our bottom, intersecting with each other in a very destructive way. So if I Control Z on that, the way that I created or kind of fixed the problem that I made for myself was I went back to our transformation nodes here right before our blend, and I just came in and I scaled it up by hand to the edge of our texture here. And if I come down to our left side and I bring this over as well, just to the edge of our texture, now we've got the overlap of our chains from left to right, and we still keep it proportionate to our top and our bottom. And so if you've been following along, you're probably thinking, well, it's looking all right so far, but this still intersects, and it looks like that it's just been soldered together rather than wrapped around and having it go over top and then below and looping like a chain link fence would. And so how we're going to go about creating that is we're going to take the right and the left side of the chain link that we created and applying a gradient over top of it, so that from one end we're going to have something that is in the forefront, and as you get down the chain it's going to be in the background. So what we're going to do is I'm going to add a blend on our right side here, and I'm going to actually take the output and I'm going to plug that into the opacity, because I don't want a color for the background. I don't really want to blend two textures together. I just want to use the white and the black mask values from our transform and just mask off a gradient map. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient 1, and I'm going to plug this guy into our foreground. And now if you take a look, you can see that the accumulation of the gradient map with the mask creates this kind of sloping effect of our material here, thinking about how white is going to be very, very high geometry, and as the values get darker, that's going to be more recessed in our geometry. And you can see here that at the top, where our gradient map indicates, it's going to be very, very tall, and as we work down our gradient, you can see it very sinks into the geometry. And so I'm going to do this for both our left and our right side, once again adding a blend, making sure that we plug it into just the opacity, and I'm going to add a gradient linear 1 to this guy as well, and I'm going to plug that into the foreground. And I want to make sure that for this gradient map, I set the rotation to 180 degrees, so that both of our links here are working in opposite directions, where we have the right side being higher up, the left side is going to be a little bit in the background, and vice versa, where the left side is higher up, we're going to have the right side slinking into the background. And so if we take a look in our material here, you can see it started to take a little bit of effect on the intersection between our two chains, where we've got the top of the right side kind of coming over top of the left, and then kind of coming a little bit underneath as it gets down, and vice versa for our left side. As we work our way up on the left side, it's a little bit over top of the chain on over here, but it's a little bit underneath on this side as well. The one thing that I want to fix is I want to make sure that we don't have our chain sinking too much into the back of our geometry, and I want to make sure that we really emphasize the looping, or the interwovenness of our two links here. And so how I go about doing that is I'm going to add a levels node on top of our gradient. And so now if I go into our levels and I start playing around with the scale, you can see how it affects our gradient map and how it also affects our geometry here. Bringing down the white value obviously increases the height so much that we don't really get too many black values, but if we increase the black, it pretty much just erases any of the geometry that we have. And so one way that we can be more specific with how we change our values here is if we go up to the right hand side with our specific parameters and we just click on values, and this is just going to give us a bunch of sliders with actual numeric detail. It just better allows us to fine-tune any of the properties. And so for our level low in, which is just our black value here, if we start bumping that up, we can start to see where our gradient starts to kind of cut off from each other. If I bump this up to something like 0.45, you can see that that's where it starts to come underneath the chain that's coming down here. So from here on out, we want to make sure that this value is darker than the value of our left chain, so that it appears like it's coming underneath. And so I'm going to keep our level, or our black value, at 0.45, and I'm going to bump up our level low out, which is our black output here. So if I bring that up to 0.5, now we're getting a bit of a gray level or a gray value in our gradient map. And so it's not going to disappear anymore because it isn't completely black. Black in this scenario means that it's completely gone and it's just flat geometry. So I want to make sure that we have something like 0.5. It's just a nice middle gray. And you can see that it's starting to appear like it's coming underneath. To really make this effect look better, we have to decrease our level high or our white value down to something like 0.5. And so now we're going to get a very, very contrasting gradient map here. And you can see that we start to get the effect that looks like it's coming down over top and then slinking away underneath. You also want to make sure that your level in mid, or your little gray node up at the top there, we want to just set that kind of in between our white value and our black value. So I set that to something like 0.48. Just so that we're getting a little bit of a nice middle gradient there. And that's where our left side comes over top of our right side. So we want to make sure that the middle point of our gradient is kind of set right in here so that it looks like our chain is actually coming right underneath. And so now that we've got the right side sorted out, I'm just going to copy and I'm going to paste our levels down here, and I'm going to plug in our bottom levels or our bottom gradient and then plug this levels into the top of our left side. And so now we're going to get the inverse where our white gradient is at the bottom coming over top of our right chain or our right link and then slowly grading away and coming underneath. And so now our chain link is really starting to take effect here. And so now I'm just going to come back to our tile generator here and I'm going to bring it down to 3 by 2 because I want to focus in on creating kind of a seamless warping for the link between our tile vertically. And so if we come back to our transformation 2D here, I want to make sure that I switch our height to something like 103%. And now if we take a look, it starts to look like we've got our chains coming up and twirling around. And we've got them looping with each other so that they actually look like they've been linked together. And so now that we've got our chain links all sorted out and we've got our scaling and our looping all figured out, I think it's time that we can get rid of our base material here. So I'm going to click on that guy and delete him. I'm going to bring our levels down and I'm going to use this for our height. And I'm going to bring our normals over and plug this guy in as well. So now if I right click and I view and outputs, we are going to get a pretty familiar looking cube with a few differences. And so in order to change our base color, we're going to actually use a physically based value that Substance has already provided for us, and it's called the PBR metal reflectance. And so if we look this guy up, we can just take a look. It is a preset of metal reflectance colors to be used with PBR shaders. And so if we take a look at some of its parameters, you can see that we've got a whole bunch of just physically based and physically correct metal colors to choose from. So if I click on iron, it's going to give us the physically correct hue and color value for our iron. And if we go down to platinum, you can see that there's just subtle differences within each metal. And so I'm going to go with iron, and I'm going to plug that guy in, and it's going to color everything in our iron color. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a blend on top of our color here, and I'm just going to take our tile generator here and I'm just going to plug that into our opacity. And I also want to make sure that we plug this guy into our foreground, And I'm also just going to add a levels node over top to make sure that we don't really have any gradients or slopes in our material here, and we just get a white and black values. So I'm going to make sure to ramp up our whites. So that we get that effect. The next thing I'm going to do is come down to our roughness, and I'm going to add a curvature smooth. And just like any other tutorial I've done, we want to make sure that we plug in our normal map into our curvature smooth. And then we want to run our curvature through a levels node so that we can invert the color information that we're getting, or the grayscale information that we're getting, because right now the shiniest parts are going to be our black values here, and the white values are going to be very rough. So if I plug this guy in, the shiniest parts that we're going to get are actually in the corners here versus the edges where we would expect most of the gloss to be. So I'm just going to click on our levels node and invert our black and our white inputs. So now we've got our shiniest bits being right on the edges which are most exposed to our light source. And moving on down to our metallic output, we want to make sure that we indicate that our chains are metal and not the background information. And so we've actually already created a mask for our base color here, which we can use just to plug into our metallic output. And now we start to get some metallic properties and what we would expect our iron chains to look like. And what this indicates is anything that's in black is going to be a non-metal, basically a dielectric. So anything that isn't a metal material, it will display non-metal properties, and vice versa for anything that's in the white value is going to be considered a metal, and so it's going to use metallic properties when it's being rendered. And now we've got two more outputs that I want to take a look at, the first one being our ambient occlusion. So I'm going to come down and type output, and I want to make sure that we identify it as ambient occlusion. And we want to make sure that it is in the material group. And so now for this, what you can do is type in ambient occlusion, and we've got a node just down here for our actual ambient occlusion. And if we plug in our tile generator here, you can see it starts to generate our shadowing detail, or our shading detail. And if we bump up our quality to 16 samples, we want to make sure that our GPU optimization is also enabled true to drastically reduce the draw call time that it takes. And we want to also bring down our height depth just a little bit so that it's not as shadowy. And we can also play around with our radius. And so we get just a nice white and black kind of effect there. And so if we plug this guy in and we right click and view outputs in 3D, now we're going to start to get a little bit of ambient occlusion in between the knots and the loops. And again, anyone using Unity 5 and has watched any of my previous tutorials knows what's next, is we just want to create a levels, and we're going to take our curvature here and just run it through. And so if we take a look at this and we just reference our ambient occlusion map here, we can get something that is relatively close. And I won't spend too much time going over this just because it's really fine-tuning it yourself and just really just your best guess. And so again, there isn't too much of a discrepancy or a difference between the two, just a little bit more in the loops. But again, that can be easily affected by just bumping up our black. Alrighty. And so now the final and possibly the most important step for creating a believable chain link material is getting rid of anything that isn't actually our fence. And so how we go about doing that is really simple. We just have to create another output. And for this output, we have to indicate that it is used for opacity. So we go add item, and we come down. It should be the third from the top. And we want to click on opacity. So I'm just going to name this opacity. And again, we want to make sure that it is in the material group. And so now what the opacity output is just a black and white texture or a mask, just like our metallic, to indicate what do we want to view, being the white, and what do we want to just basically eliminate or erase or not view, which will be our black. So again, we've already created a perfect mask. And so I'm just going to use that as our opacity input or our output. And so if I right click anywhere in our graph and I do view outputs in 3D, all of a sudden we're going to just start viewing our chain link, and we're not going to see any of the material underneath of it. And so now we can also take our chain material and take it one step further by creating a rust material over top of our chains here, so to give it a bit of a weathering effect. And so we don't actually have to go about making this rust material or this rust filter, because there's already one built into Substance Designer. So I'm going to come up to our chain link here, and I'm just going to hit new substance graph, and I'm going to call this one rusted chain. And so now the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that we add an ambient occlusion and an opacity output, because as of right now we've only got down to our height. So let me just do this real quick. Alright, so now we've got all of the outputs that we're going to need. We can just click and drag our chain graph directly into our graph here. And if we go up and we make sure to change our connection to material, and we just click and drag, we're going to get all of our connections in the correct output. And if we just right click and view outputs in 3D, we're going to get the same thing that we've got in our chain here. How we go about creating the rust is if we actually just start to type in rust, we get this rust weathering. And if we click on that, it gives us this huge long node. And right now we've got more inputs than we actually are going to use. So if we come down to channels, we want to make sure that we get rid of some of the ones that we're not going to use, such as diffuse, specular, and glossiness. I also want to make sure in our advanced tab that we check true on utilizing a mask. Just because we've got a material that is utilizing an opacity output, so we want to make sure that we just mask off the areas that we don't really need. And so if I click and drag all of my sockets into here, we're only going to manually have to plug in our ambient occlusion to the ambient occlusion on here. And if I just disconnect all of these so we can see, I also have an ambient occlusion down here as well, and I want to make sure to plug it in both spots, and then use either your metallic or your opacity as your mask. In this case, I'm going to use opacity. And so now you can see that our chain link is entirely rusted over. So if we go back to our material connection and we connect all of these to the sockets, making sure that you have your single selected and taking your opacity down into the Ampacity output. Now we're getting our rusted chain in our viewport here. And so if we just click on our rust weathering and we scroll down and we bring down our rust spreading, now you can see the parameters that we can use to get varying rust effects. And if I come back to our chain here and I bump up the tiling to say something like 10.9, you can see the rusting effect that's starting to take place. And you have a whole bunch of parameters that we get to change, such as our normal intensity. You can change the roughness of your rust, make it a little bit shinier. You can even change the height intensity to make your rust actually pop off of your material here. And so hopefully you guys didn't skip ahead to this part, but if you did, it's alright, I get it. The surprise was that I wanted to give away this material to you guys, the SBS and the .SBSR, as well as all of the associated textures for free, because this marks the milestone of my 500 subscribers, and I thought that I wanted to do something just a little bit special for you guys. So in the description of this video, I've linked my Patreon page, and if you go over to my page and you click on posts, the chain link fence tutorial should be the first one that you guys see. So you can just click on it, open it up, take a look at everything I've written, and you can just download the zip file that I've provided for you guys. I just wanted to do this as a bit of a thank you for everybody who's supported me on Patreon and everybody who's watched my videos and given me some good critique and support. As well, if there's anything that anybody wants to see or learn how to do, by all means, let me know. This video was brought to you by Darty367. He suggested that I do a chain link, and lo and behold, we now have a tutorial. So thanks for all the support, guys. I look forward to teaching you some new stuff in the future. Have a good one.